Hi, and welcome to Dutch the Podcast. I'm Mike. There's Tom Byfoot. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
Good, thanks so much. Excited about today's show, of course. I want to remind you if you are a fan of the show, don't forget to subscribe, tell a friend about it, leave your comments, and of course, your questions always welcome at DutchTheMedia.com, where you will
Look,
find exciting things happening all the time. It's the home of Dutch the Magazine, Dutch the Podcast, and Mocum Publishing, including De Krant, which means I think I might be cueing you, Tom, for
okay,
something pretty
which
exciting.
means that we'd love to hear your feedback, as Mike says, at dutchthemedia.com. And, we've got listeners to this podcast all over the world. There's Dutch people everywhere, as we
It's
well
true.
know. But, the magazine, the print magazine, that beautiful glossy print magazine that I sent to the printer today, the March-April issue, with some really interesting content. Maybe we'll get to it, maybe not, because we've got a great guest waiting for us. But the magazine we've only been mailing really in Canada and the US,
Mhm.
simply because the mailing costs of a magazine, right, Mike? You understand that, to actually to give you an example, current price for an overseas subscription for only 6 issues is $150. We can't help it. That's what it costs to ship it overseas. But for
Yeah.
less than $30, you can now get an online digital only subscription to Dutch the Magazine
Like,
anywhere in the world.
you can flip through the magazine right there on your tablet?
It's beautiful. You can see it on your tablet. You can see it on your laptop. You can see it on your phone. It reads just like the magazine does. The only
Wow.
thing is you're not holding paper in your hands. But for half the price, even of a North American subscription, you can get a digital subscription. And tell you what, Mike, we've been doing this for a while now, right?
Mhm.
Um, we've covered some very interesting topics. Some of these topics we covered were extensions of articles in the magazine or related to articles in the magazine.
Yeah.
So we've published since we launched in the fall of 2011. So that's a while back.
Wow,
Since
yeah.
then, we've published hundreds of articles about the Netherlands, about Dutch people, about Dutch culture, recipes, 4 or 5 recipes in every single issue. As part of your digital subscription, $29.50 a year, you get all those back issues
Oh,
in
wow.
digital format online. Isn't that
Wow.
cool?
That's fantastic because the magazine, there's so much evergreen content in there, wonderful stories and interviews, and people who have left us that left their mark in this magazine and in this wonderful publication, and that it's available this way now. Congratulations to us all, and to those people that we hear from through the podcast. Who love the magazine idea but don't have access to it? Well, now you do. Congratulations!
Yeah,
That's
great.
fantastic news.
So go to dutchthemedia.com. You can sign up. You can take out a digital subscription, pay with your credit card or PayPal or whatever works best for you, and you will have access to literally that whole back catalog. Now, one thing I have to mention: it takes a little while to upload all the back copies. So we've got 4 years up now, but my commitment is we will have the full where are we 13 years by the time this is going out. 13 years, 6 issues a year, 50 pages an issue, a huge amount of content.
Oh, that's fantastic. And as we say, a vast audience now has access to all of it. So that's fantastic. All right. Well, let's contribute to this content today. We have another interview. Tom, who are we speaking with today?
We're speaking with Arthur Boers, and Arthur's just published a book, a memoir about his own life, and he is Dutch, of course. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking about him. He
That's
grew up
fair.
as he was born in Canada.
Yeah.
His parents immigrated from the Netherlands, and he had a very fraught relationship with his dad, which. As an interesting parallel, actually, with my dad as well. Both men were sent to the Dutch East Indies after World War II, came back with differing levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. They weren't recognized in the Netherlands. When they got back, they were basically told, suck it up, get on with your life, which caused a lot of rage. Well, Arthur felt a lot of that rage personally. And we should really listen to his story about it. But what's really very impressive and interesting about the story is how Arthur processed his youth in his later life. He is now an Anglican pastor, an Anglican priest. He grew up in a Dutch Reformed environment, and he did something that was very typically Dutch for his dad. His dad had a company which built greenhouses. Now, that's, of course, something we've talked about before. So his memoir is called Shattered, and which directly refers back to the glass in many different ways. And maybe we should listen to Arthur first, and then afterwards we can maybe pick up the pieces.
Okay, let's enjoy that interview now.
We're talking to Arthur Boers. Welcome to Dutch the Podcast, Arthur. Great to have you on the show. And let's dive straight in. I went to your website, let's mention it, arthurboers.com. And there you use the tagline, Pilgrim, Paddler, Author. What's that mean? Who is Arthur Boers? Let's start there.
Okay, so I call myself a pilgrim because I've been a seeker all my life. I've been yearning all my life. I've always believed there's something more than just what we see. And so I've always been interested in, spirituality and religion and God and all that kind of stuff. And that was true already when I was a child. And eventually I became a minister as a result. And I've also taught at a seminary as a result of that. So I've always had that. And then pilgrim, I probably would have called myself a pilgrim for a long time, but it especially came into force in 2005 when I walked the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage route in Spain, a trip that really, no exaggeration, changed my life and changed my perspective on many, many different things. I did write a book about that called The Way is Made by Walking, but it continues to inform me, and I continue to learn new things all the time. And my worldview keeps getting shaken up. I'm 66 now, and there's still things that I'm waking up to, partly in connection with the book, and we'll talk about that later. And then I'm one of the things I love being outdoors. I love hiking. I hiked the Bruce Trail in Ontario, and that's what led me to walk the Camino de Santiago in Spain. And then for a time, I was living in Indiana, and where I lived in Indiana was very flat, so hiking was boring. And so one of my friends said, well, you should try paddling. And so I became a paddler. First, I had a kayak, and then I had a canoe, and I also have a stand-up paddle board now. And so I love to paddle, and we have a place a couple hours north of Toronto on a river. I call the river Glad River, and I like to paddle on that river. And it's just one of the happiest things that I do in my life. And then I also call myself an author because all my life I've been interested in writing. When I was 12, I already wrote a novel, which, never saw the light of day and should not see the light of day. But, I've worked at my writing ever since then. And writing is a big priority for me.
Oh, that's great. Is that, by the way, the river behind you that we see for those of us watching on YouTube?
Oh, that's a painting that does display my love of water, but it's a painting from an artist in Mississauga, and that's actually the lake shore in Mississauga, as I understand it.
Okay.
But yeah, I love water. I love rocks, and I love Canadian Shield. It's my favorite geography. I went on the train across Canada last year, and it was a great trip. The whole thing was wonderful, but my favorite part was looking at Canadian Shield geography.
Yeah, and that you're right about that in your latest book, Shattered, and let's get to that because that's really what we want to talk about in this podcast. You've written many books over the decades, but Shattered really interested me for Dutch the Podcast because it's got this Dutch theme. Could you take us through the subject matter and also maybe what prompted you to write the book?
Sure. So yeah, as you've said, I've been writing books for a long time, for over 30 years, and most of those books would be considered kind of teaching books, pastoral theology books, exploring church conflict or the Lord's Prayer or theology of leadership, all kinds of different things. But about 10 years ago, I thought I would like to write a book about my childhood. It would be a very different kind of book, more of a memoir kind of book. And I thought there were three interesting things that about my childhood. One is I grew up in this Dutch culture as a third culture kid. I'm sure you'll want to talk more about that with me, and I'd be glad to do so. I thought that'd be worth exploring. I also was already very religious. As I mentioned, I was religious as a child. I had mystical experiences as a child. I thought that would be worth exploring. And then I also wanted to write about the mystery of my father. My father was a brilliant man, had a great education, came to Canada as a young man, started a very successful business, developed an unusual form of greenhouses that were really well suited to North America. And they went all over North America, but eventually they were exported around the world, including to the Netherlands, which was his great coup to go back to the homeland. And so he was a brilliant man. He's quite funny. He loved music. I loved him a lot. But he was also a tortured and anguished man. So he had great struggles with anger, and he abused alcohol, and he was violent on occasion. And so I had this mystery. I was trying to explore this mystery of my dad. And I thought, well, I'll explore that in the book as well. And I did end up writing about all three themes in the book, but the most important really is the mystery of my father and the relationship with my father. Eventually, I realized that he had PTSD, and it was something that we didn't know about when I was a kid. And really, it had not occurred to me until I started writing this book. And then I saw that really explained a lot of what went on for my father.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm sure we'll get to that. And there's some parallels to my own life there that really made the book extra interesting for me. But let's go to you mentioned greenhouses. So you called your book Shattered, and on the back of the book it says it's a sensitive and penetrating reflection on coming of age in a Dutch immigrant family. So there's that reflection. There's the shattering of glass. There's the reflection in glass. There's the pieces you talk about. It's a recurring motif. You've built a lot of the story around glass, reflections, water. Can you go into that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. So as I was writing this book, one day I had a dream. I think I allude to the dream in the book. I had a dream of my father. He and I were in a greenhouse that had been shattered by a hailstorm, which happened occasionally. And it meant insurance business. So it was good for my dad's business. But of course, he felt sorry for greenhouse farmers. And so he and I were in this demolished greenhouse. And I picked up an old putty can, and I was going to start picking up broken pieces of glass, which is actually the first job I ever did for my dad. When I was 11, he would bring me to work sites, and I would clean up broken glass. And so I was going to do that. And then my father said in the dream, "That's okay, son. You don't have to do that anymore." And, dreams are weird, right? Because they get at you in a slanted way. And when I woke up, I felt like the dream was telling me two things. And one was my dad was releasing me to do the work that I really needed to do. That is the writing of this book. So I was grateful for that. But also, as I thought about it, I realized, oh my goodness, glasses throughout my life, throughout my whole life. My parents came from the Glazenstad, which is an area of Holland, means the glass city. And that's because there are just so many greenhouses. You can go there and you'll see miles and miles of greenhouses, as extending to the horizon. It's pretty amazing.
That's in the Westland, right? Just south of The Hague, in that corner on the coast.
Correct, near Hoek van Holland and all that kind of area.
Yeah.
So, and I do have a Frisian grandfather, but he did his agricultural apprenticeship in the Glazenstad. And among other things, a greenhouse that he was working in got shattered by a hailstorm, and he ate the peaches that fell to the ground. Those greenhouses were growing peaches because he was so hungry in the boarding house. He didn't have enough food. And the peaches were needled with broken glass. And so he had abdominal damage for decades, which wasn't really fixed until he came here as an immigrant to Canada. And they saved for the first year, they saved up $1,000, and then he had surgery done. That would have been 30 something years after his accident. So my father built greenhouses. He sold greenhouses. He sold glass. So that was a big part of our income. We worked with glass all the time, and we've all had accidents in my family. We all have accidents with glass. I had stitches because of accidents with glass. I still have scars. And my father had a lot of scars because he glazed with glass. And there was something else I was going to tell you, but
That's an occupational hazard, you know.
yeah.
I guess as you describe it, you still have the scars to show for it.
Right. Oh, yeah. And then my first memory of my dad actually is he threw a potted plant at my mother in the living room. I was 3 years old, and it went through the picture window. So my first image of my dad was broken glass. So yeah, glass is everywhere.
You also start the book with a photograph of you on was it your your grandfather's shoulders, I believe, right?
Right. Yes.
And that's also framed in glass again.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's a picture that's framed in glass, and my grandfather is lifting me up, and he's lifting me up to. This was in Holland. I was in Holland as a baby, and he's lifting me up to a picture of my dad on the wall, which is also behind glass. So you kind of see the three generations of men there in that photo.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful image as you read through it as well. You mentioned you were a baby in Holland, but you were born in Canada, right? You were visiting at the time.
Yeah,
Um,
my dad he lost his job in '57. It was a really bad year economically, and so to save money, he and my mom went over to Holland for a few months and stayed with his parents.
But you were born in Canada, but you grew up very Dutch, and this interests me also because my parents were immigrants as well, but they returned to Holland after 10 years abroad, and I was 4 years old when we went back to Holland. So you often get that thought, you know, what if my life had been slightly different? What would have happened if I'd grown up an immigrant child? So can you talk a little bit about what it was like to grow up as a third culture kid, second generation Dutch in Canada?
Yeah. So I grew up, we spoke Dutch at home. I was the oldest. And, for the first few years, I was the only one. So we only spoke Dutch at home. So Dutch is my first language. My parents gave me, this was the 1950s. Conformism was important. So they thought they should give me an English name, even though they really thought of themselves as Dutch. I was named after my grandfather, Ari, but they thought I should have an English name. So they named me Arthur. But of course, with their strong Dutch accents, they couldn't actually pronounce my name. They called me Arthur. My mom still calls me Arthur. She's 90 years old, and to the day he died, my dad never called me Arthur. And in fact, I didn't even pronounce my name correctly. It wasn't until kindergarten that I learned how to say the th, and the kindergarten teacher put her finger in my mouth finally to get me to put my tongue in the right place. So I had a very kind of strong sense of being Dutch, and we were proud of being Dutch, and we kind of disdained other cultures, and everybody else was Canadian. Doesn't matter whether they were Italian or Scottish or English or whatever. We kind of dismissed everybody as Canadian because they didn't do things in ways that made sense to us. And I went to a Dutch denomination, a Dutch church. I was Christian Reformed Church. Everybody was Dutch. I went to a so-called Christian school, but everybody was Dutch. They were all Christian Reformed. We went to the Shell station, which is, of course, a Dutch corporation. It was owned by a member of our church, and we'd pull up to the pumps, and there'd be other church members there. And our electrician was Dutch, and our plumber was Dutch. They were brothers. They were members of our church. A block away from the Shell station was the Dutch Credit Union, and there was also the Dutch store for Dutch dry goods, and there was also a Dutch electronics store. So we were kind of, even though we didn't all live in the same place, it was not quite a ghetto in that way. We were very sheltered. We just hung around mostly with Dutch people.
And that's fascinating to me because a professor called Arthur Schreier did a study of the Dutch immigrants in Ontario, a sociological study, and he at one point says in the 1960s you would hear more Dutch spoken in downtown Grimsby, Ontario, than you would English on occasion. And you grew up not far from Grimsby, right? St. Catharines and Niagara-on-the-Lake, I believe.
That's right.
How vibrant was it? Well, you've basically explained already your Dutch stores, your Dutch gas station. How widespread was it? How did that bubble feel?
Oh, well, there were Dutch people everywhere. So I ended up living in St. David's, small town of 500 near Queenston. I was there during my teen years. And while I was writing the book, I just counted up all the Dutch people I knew within a mile. And there were like between 12 and 15 Dutch households right there. When we lived in an apartment in St. Catharines, there were Dutch people right across the hall. Everybody who lived there were always Dutch. So we were always aware of Dutch people. We were always looking out for Dutch people, especially Calvinist Dutch people. Catholic Dutch people, we weren't, we had some.
Weren't too interested in.
But yeah, they weren't as interesting to us. Yeah. So it was very prevalent. And as you know, there are a lot of Dutch descendants here in Canada. So I'm running into Dutch. I was in the airport recently. My daughter and her son and our new granddaughter came from Oregon to visit. And I went into the airport to greet them. And I started singing to my granddaughter, "Klappes in your hunches, blah, blah, blah." And there was a couple standing 4 feet away, and they looked at me and they said, "We know what that song means." They were Dutch people. I mean, we were always running into Dutch people. That's a lot.
Yeah. Even I do as well. And because we're more recent immigrants, I speak Dutch to my kids still, and we've got to be very careful not to speak out of turn, because there's almost always someone who can understand us. Yeah. So can I just get back to one more aspect of growing up Dutch? Yeah. You guys came in the 1950s, and as we know, 500,000 Dutch people left the Netherlands in that period. 200,000 came to Canada. There's 1 million descendants now. But you were seen by, let's call them real Canadians, as DPs, displaced persons, immigrants. You tell a story in your book about the first time your family rented a cottage in Muskoka for a brief vacation, and you came into contact with some upper class Canadians.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. My parents felt it, and my dad actually felt it more keenly than I did. To be called DPs felt like a quite an insult. And actually, my mom and her family came in 48, so they were among the really early immigrants. My dad came in 54 by himself.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, the Dutch chose to immigrate. I mean, there was strong stimulus from the government, both governments, Dutch and Canadians. Yeah. But the DPs were what we would nowadays call refugees or asylum seekers, and the Dutch did not view themselves as such.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So, and then, when I was growing up, if you watched the news and watched the people in power, they tended to be people with English ancestry, English-speaking ancestry, Scottish, English, Irish, whatever. And so, or maybe French Canadian, but, a lot of politicians, union leaders, business leaders. So there was this kind of elite. And I know my father really resented that. And we felt discriminated against at that time. That's no longer a reality for Dutch people, I don't think. I certainly don't feel it. I don't think that's the case. There are other things going on. But that was
it's odd, actually. It happened to me only once, since I've been in Canada now for 25 years. When I got my first job, someone said, couldn't they found a Canadian for that job? And I think that's totally out of character. Let me be clear. We are absolutely welcome, and Canada is a very welcoming country to immigrants, refugees of all stripes. So nothing against that. It's just, I noticed that in stories from people came a little earlier, before multiculturalism, etc.
Yeah, it's really changed. I mean, so my parents felt like they couldn't call me Ari because it was not an English name. So they gave me an English name they couldn't pronounce. Now it's okay to have any kind of name. And I don't mean that disparagingly, but I listen to CBC and I hear the names of reporters and announcers, and I'm like, I wonder how to spell it. I have no idea how to spell it. It's such an unfamiliar name. And so that's more the norm now. And I feel very good about it. I've lived a lot in the States. I've lived mostly in Canada, and I prefer Canada for a number of reasons. And one is we're more welcoming to a wide diversity of people from around the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's just different, interesting to see how that has changed over the years. Let's get to your dad. Okay, so your dad lived through World War II in the Netherlands, which we all know. We've spoken about it on the podcast several times. Was a brutal experience.
Yeah.
My dad did as well, and then after the war, in 1945, when the Netherlands was liberated, to a large extent by Canadian troops, but also American and British, of course, and Polish. The Netherlands had this big colony, the Dutch East Indies, and the Dutch East Indies had declared independence at the end of the war when the Japanese surrendered. And the Dutch did not want to grant that independence, and an armed force was sent over, and a lot of young Dutchmen who just lived through that war were sent over there to fight the guerrilla insurgents. And this was a brutal war. Just for our listeners who are not aware of the history, those young men were sent over there to fight a war that ultimately they lost. That was an unjust war in a lot of things. There were a lot of atrocities on both sides. Let's be fair. These men came back, young men, boys, some when they were sent, at least men when they came back, maybe. My dad was among them. Your dad was among them. Yeah. And when they got back to the Netherlands, they were almost ignored. They were basically told, suck it up, get on with your life. Yeah, you went to the Indies. Okay, we've all suffered. You know, it was in that post-war period. Yeah. And of course, almost all of these men suffered from PTSD. And it was not a term that was used at the time, was known even at the time, but it informed the rest of their lives. And when I was reading your book, and I've got to be honest, I put your book aside. We met about a year ago when we talked about this. I put it aside because I was a little afraid to start reading it. Because of what I would find out about myself, my relationship with my dad. And there was this recognition of attitudes, the way of dealing with problems, the way of approaching things that I recognized in your dad's story. And there's this underlying rage. We hear a lot about transgenerational trauma these days. Would you consider what you describe transgenerational trauma, or maybe not? Can you reflect on that maybe a little bit?
Yeah, probably start somewhere else, and if I don't answer your question,
absolutely,
then
sure,
bring me back. But yeah, I think the Indonesian piece is huge. A lot of people died. 90,000 Indonesians died, and it was a war that did not get a lot of coverage. The world was war weary, and frankly, it wasn't white people who were dying. I think that's a race. That's a component of how it was covered. And my father went as a volunteer. He was very proud of being a volunteer. And all his life, he had really good friends who were also volunteers. So he had a real bond with them. And, a lot of this mystified me until I really started thinking about a PTSD. And that's where he started smoking. He had anger issues the rest of his life. He had nightmares for the rest of his life, all had to do with Indonesia. When I tell people about the Indonesian War and they've never heard of it, I say, well, look at footage from Vietnam. There's a lot of similarity between those two. So there are a couple things that I would say. One is, one of the ways that I read what happened was traumatized people traumatize people. And so we see this, for example, between Israel and Gaza right now. We have two severely traumatized groups, and they're both severely traumatized, and then they inflict trauma on each other. And a little bit, that's how I see what the Dutch were doing. They got their butts beat for 5 years from the Nazis, and then they went and beat somebody else's butts. And so that's a kind of a human cycle that we have. We see it over and over again. People get liberation from trauma, and then they often traumatize other folks. So that's a very sad, and tragic reality that happens. This also happens in families. So, I know my great-grandfather beat my grandfather. I know my grandfather beat my father, and I know my father beat me. And, we see that over and over, that patterns of abuse get passed from generation to generation. And unless somebody decides to interrupt that and stop the violence or the trauma, it will not end. And so, yeah, I really do believe in intergenerational trauma. And I see it in the scriptures as well. I think it's as a minister, of course, I see these things somewhat theologically, but yeah, I really do believe in transgenerational trauma.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you reflect on that trauma that then gets inflicted on someone else. I hadn't thought about it that way, and I thought of more on the individual level of the soldiers who came back. And yes, my dad was a volunteer as well, and reading through it, I think your dad and mine would have had a lot of touch points if they'd known. And they may have even seen each other at reunions, because they went to reunions all the time.
My dad went to the reunions, and I'm like, why is he going to these reunions decades later? Well, it's one place where he could talk to people who had a similar experience, and they got each other. But
they understood each other. Yeah,
we met. You and I met. We had some conversations, but we met face to face at the Netherlands Luncheon Club last year. And I was out in the hall with my books before the program, and several people came and talked to me about the book. And I said, I think my father had PTSD. And you know what the response was? Was he in Indonesia? My father was in Indonesia. And some of the boys from my Christian school from grade 6 have been contacting me. I haven't talked to them since they were 12 years old. And they're like, your story is very familiar. My father was in Indonesia. And did you know Rick's father was in Indonesia? And John's father was in Indonesia. And so it's a really kind of prevalent thing, especially when I'm in Dutch contexts. It's coming up over and over again. The other thing that's interesting to me about this is that other immigrant groups and other refugees have started talking to me. So I've done some workshops with a young therapist. She's in her mid-30s, and her specialty is second-generation Canadians and immigration and intergenerational trauma. Her parents are refugees from the Cultural Revolution in China, which is a very different than mine, but there are parallel dynamics. And she and I did a presentation one time, and a young fellow, his parents were in the Hungarian Revolution and were traumatized by that, and he was comparing notes with me. So it's a very Dutch story, and I'm glad to talk with Dutch people. I like being Dutch. I think you can tell that. But it's also intriguing to me that a story like this, if you tell it well and dig deeply, it's going to resonate with other people. It's going to have parallels for other people's experience, even if they're a different culture or a different era of history.
I agree with you, and that's something that I think this book is not for Dutch people. This book is for people in general. And you are very open. You really share a lot. You open up your soul to the reader, and it was fascinating to read. Maybe we can get to your journey. You talk about yourself as a seeker. You weave your spiritual journey through the story of your youth, your childhood, your adulthood, and you start out in a Dutch Reformed community. Now, from the book, it's clear your family was not central to that. You're more or less on the fringes of that. You'd occasionally go to the United Church. You got involved with a Mennonite youth group, and then ultimately you became an Anglican priest, an Anglican pastor. How does that fit? Can you talk about that maybe a little bit?
Sure. Well, that's a long story.
Okay.
I think one of the things that I would say is that I have been thinking about this a lot, and I was frankly a little worried at first when the book tour took me to Christian Reformed contexts, because I thought they would be annoyed with me because I didn't stay with the Christian Reformed. I left as a teenager, which was very unusual then. It was unusual for anyone to leave the church, but even more unusual for teenagers. But I'm getting a real welcome on the whole from Christian Reformed people, because they feel like I am accurately reflecting things that happened and dynamics that happened. And of course, that church has changed a lot since I was a teenager. So I'm very grateful for the Christian Reformed background. I went to Christian school for 6 years. It formed me a lot. I learned a lot. I'm grateful for it. I think what I would say in retrospect is that Calvinism is a very cerebral theology. It's very much in the head. And I've always been kind of more of a mystical person, an experiential person. And so I would argue with the minister about theology, and we wouldn't come to agreement. And so that was part of my frustration, but it was really more, I was looking more for an experience of religious faith. And so it's the experience that drew me to other places.
That's beautiful. So before we wrap up and talk a little bit about where we can find your book, is there anything else you'd like to talk to or add to the conversation? Thank you so much for sharing so much. I've really enjoyed it. But is there anything else?
Well, it's good to be with you. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate it very much. I really love this book. As I say, I've written a number of books, about 10 books or so, and I think this is my most beautiful and most important book. I'm astonished by the responses I'm getting from people who are interested and want to go out for coffee with me or a meal and talk about and debrief the book. Total strangers, and so
that's great. That's actually, I was going to ask you about that. So maybe specific, you mentioned other Dutch kids with Indonesian veteran dads, but any other groups that you would say? You also talked about other cultures, but people who've gone through different traumas. Have you heard from Indonesia veterans at all themselves? I mean, they'd be in their 80s and 90s now.
Yeah. I have not heard from Indonesian veterans, but I'm going to Holland Christian Homes in a month or two to speak out about the book, and I'm sure there will be some there, and also widows of Indonesian veterans. The other thing that is interesting to me is, we live here in East York in Toronto. I was going to say there are no Dutch people on the street, but actually there's a Frisian down the street named William, and he and I talk about the book. We're about the same age. But there are people of a number of different ethnic groups on this block, and they came out to my book launch. And they're interested in it because they know about family violence and family conflict and family alienation, and so they're drawing a lot of connections and parallels as a result.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, Arthur, for the listeners, where can they get your book?
Yeah, so Eerdmans is a really respectable publisher. It has Dutch roots, of course. About 100 years ago, based in Grand Rapids. You can order it directly from them, but also they're part of all the normal supply routes, so you can get it through independent bookstores or through Chapters,
Amazon, Chapters, Barnes and Noble, etc. Right?
Yeah, it's widely available. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's called Shattered. It's by Arthur Boers, and you've also got your own website. Let's not forget that. Great. Yeah. ArthurBoers.com, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And wow, it's been great talking to you, Arthur. Thank you so much for joining us on Dutch the podcast.
Thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate this connection. Take care. Tot ziens.
Tot ziens.
Tom, thank you so much for bringing us that interview. What a really poignant memoir. Very Canadian, very Dutch. All at the same time, and just a really wild perspective over the course of one's life. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and thank you very much to Arthur as well for sharing such intimate details of his youth and his upbringing and his whole life with us on this podcast. I really admire that.
We tend to have these guests that do that. Fascinating people with a Dutch twist, as it were. A link to the Netherlands, which, by the way, now you have right here through this podcast. So don't forget to subscribe. All kinds of great guests previously. You can go and download those. And of course, now Dutch the magazine. It's available in digital form. Is it not, Tom?
It is, absolutely. DutchTheMedia.com. You can subscribe right there. Credit card, PayPal, whatever way works best, anywhere in the world. So our Dutch listeners in Australia and the UK, or you don't have to be Dutch, of course, to listen. If you're interested in the Netherlands, pick up the magazine now in digital format on your tablet, your phone, your laptop, whatever works best for you, and for access to all those back copies that we're putting up there as well.
A fascinating addition to Dutch the Media. DutchTheMedia.com. You see it on the screen there. We'll encourage you to go and have a visit, and certainly join us next time right here. Tom, thanks so much for Dutch the podcast this time. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Some great guests coming up. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks. Take care, Tom.